So thank you and welcome to the session UVSV, Use a Visual to Simulate the Verbal by G.A. Mudge, better known as Moby. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks to our sponsors. My name is Raquel Hutton, and I will be serving as a proctor for the session. Let's take a moment to review some housekeeping items. All conference sessions will be recorded. Microphones have been muted. You may type your questions in the chat for the presenter to answer during questions and answers. Immediately following the conclusion of the conference, you will receive an email with links to an overall conference evaluation, as well as evaluations for our breakout sessions. These evaluations are also available right now on the CAES website. Please take a moment to fill out these evaluations as they help us plan for and improve our conferences each year. This year, anyone filling out an overall conference evaluation will be entered in the drawing for a free admission to COABE's 2022 conference. If you need anything or have any questions for the presenter, please type them in the chat box. I will now turn this presentation over to Moby. Please enjoy.
Good morning. I'm talking to you from my study in Sharon, Connecticut. And thank you, Rachel, for acting as proctor. I began teaching ESL in 2007 through a church outreach program in coordination with Literacy Connections, which is a 503c organization in Poughkeepsie, New York, which promotes literacy in 4 New York counties. My training to teach ESL was 2 days of a conference over the weekend with Literacy Connections. My prior experience was many years working as a lawyer in New York City and abroad as a wordsmith, frequently working with people whose mother language was not English. And along the way, I learned how to keep it simple. At least I think so. I began teaching ESL in the fall of 2007. This session is a bit of a show and tell of my experience teaching ESL and of the development of a teaching technique, which I'm calling UVSV, or Use the Visual to Stimulate the Verbal. Now, we have to be honest. UVSV is nothing more than an organized game of show and tell. We might apply fancy names, teaching technique, instructional system, methodology, teaching system, but really it's just an organized game of show and tell. Now, when I started teaching, I quickly recognized the obvious, that the students needed to speak English, to write English, to read English, to understand English, and that to do that, they needed vocabulary and pronunciation skills, good grammar, a understanding of sentence structure, and substantive comprehension. Now, my dilemma was that I recognized that you don't learn to write unless you actually write. And when I asked my students to write, 5 sentences about almost anything, I got back precious little. They wouldn't write. And that was a problem. So eventually, I resorted to bribery. And I discovered that bribery actually works as a teaching technique. I gave my students a copy of the Christmas card that my wife and I were using in December of 2007. And I asked them to write a story about the three horses. And the three horses broke the ice and set the pace. Let's take a look at the next visual. The three horses again. And then on the right is a story written by a young man from Ecuador who basically sat by himself in the classroom, rarely spoke. He looked very sullen and unhappy most of the time. But when he was asked to write a story about the three horses, he produced something that really struck me as incredible. My father has horses near the river. He likes the horses. On the farm, we have 100 horses of different colors. There are black horses and a dark yellow horse. In fact, he has three favorite horses. One is green, another is blue, and the last one is red. I will tell you something about these three special horses. They have big heads, beautiful tails, and strong legs and feet. The red horse is a wild horse. The green horse is a quiet horse. And the last one is very, very tall. My father loves these three horses. And we have a picture to remind us always of these three special horses. Now, I was amazed by this story. The three horses had stimulated a beautiful verbal response. The student had articulated his own thoughts in English. The teacher corrected a few mistakes, but the substance, voice, and story belonged to the student. So I kept giving the students photographs, and they kept writing stories. And then I realized that there was a critical question, and that is that I really wasn't following the script that Literacy Connections had given me. I wasn't using the books that had been provided. And I recognized that I was off the reservation. So I talked with the executive director, and she said, fine, don't worry, keep doing what you're doing. And I did. And over time, a procedure evolved in the class where I would distribute a photograph and a story sheet and a vocabulary sheet and questions and hints. And the students would write a story. And then they'd study the vocabulary and they'd write a story. And in the first class, they'd read the story. And that led naturally to vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar lessons based on their reading of their own stories. And then the real homework came for the teacher. I took their stories home, I corrected them, I typed them up, and I prepared lessons from homework. And in the second class, I handed out the corrected stories, and they read them again. That led to more discussion of grammar, vocabulary, and the lessons from the homework. So as time passed, a library of over 100 stories based on 100 photographs built up. And we decided that maybe we want to go to the next slide. We decided that we should probably share this. Along the way, I had talked with the executive director of Literacy Connections every few months, and she had encouraged me to keep going. But then in 2011, we said, hey, we've got something. So we did a collaboration agreement where the concept was that Literacy Connections would get funding to publish 2 books that I would write. And the books would, one book would be titled Verbalize the Visual, Book 1, 50 Challenges. And the second book would be titled We Speak English, We Write English, We Read English. And the goal was to print the books and then distribute them in New York literacy programs. Now, I did the books, but unfortunately, Literacy Connections did not get the funding. So what were we left with? We were left with 2 books, and there the covers are. Draft dates are the same at the top, October 15, 2012. And the book on the left, Verbalize the Visual, Book 1, 50 Challenges. The book on the right, We Speak English, We Write English, We Read English. The book on the right are the stories written by my students. The book on the left is my photographs, my 50 photographs, and my 50 assignment sheets. So let's go to the next slide. There we are, the 3 horses again. On the right page of each book, the photograph. On the left of Verbalize the Visual, the assignment sheet with vocabulary and questions and hints. And in the We Speak English book, the stories written by the students. So along the way, as we were working on the applications for funding, we recognized that this approach had broad application. It had been developed teaching English as a second language, but we recognized that it could be very easily adapted to vocational training to promote workplace literacy, homeschooling, hospital schooling, could be used in elementary schools or secondary schools, adult education programs, that's us today, writing programs, teaching gifted students, teaching students with learning differences, rehab and recovery programs, prison programs, teaching substantive knowledge and skills in multiple areas, and building conversational skills of children. We recognized that there was the possibility of broad application. Now, let's take time out and have another photo and another story. This was written by a student from Guatemala. The photograph is of the military cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach in Normandy. And we all know the history of Omaha Beach in World War II on D-Day. And the story is evocative. This military cemetery is one of the few military cemeteries in this country. Many people are buried in this military cemetery. People who were soldiers and died for this country. In World War I, America lost a lot of soldiers. In World War II, it lost many more soldiers. The military cemetery was made in honor of the military who fell in war. Many crosses are in the cemetery. Each one represents a soldier killed in action. Again, a demonstration of the visual stimulating a verbal skill. Now, the question was, what was the reaction of others? And how was this approach received? It is a fact that 9 students wrote 225 stories in the We Speak English book. 1 student wrote, "Literacy helps me a lot to speak and understand, because before I didn't understand very well. Now I comprehend a little more. Literacy is very good for me because it helps me. I am happy. That is why I do not fear to speak." What a sentence. That is why I do not fear to speak. Along the way, a prototype of the book was used in Maplebrook School in Amenia, New York. And the teacher who used it wrote the following: "My students were very inspired by all of the photographs and participated in lengthy discussions regarding the subject matter in each photo. Just a fantastic tool for teaching and encouraging students to write. The UVSV technique is a wonderful concept and very motivating for the students and the teacher. As a teacher, I am enjoying the UVSV technique. I am impressed with the presentation of the material and how it has inspired my students. I find it to be an exceptional teaching tool, and I am confident that my students have enjoyed the technique. How wonderful to have fun while learning." I was amazed when I received that assessment. Moving on to the next slide. The executive director of Literacy Connections was very supportive in the development of this technique and the books. And I think her words are important to recognize. "In my 15 years working in the field of basic literacy instruction for English speaking and immigrant adults, I have not seen any innovation as striking or more important than the UVSV books. In using the visual to stimulate the verbal, Mudge has done nothing less than create a new standard for adult learning materials that inspires the students to think, write, and speak with increasing vocabulary, and best of all, to cultivate their imaginings. We could all benefit from these books, learners, teachers, and thinkers at all levels." I couldn't quite believe that endorsement. In another context, Margaret Pfaff adds, "Your work with your students demonstrates the success of your efforts to teach students to speak, write, and read English. and most importantly, to stimulate students to think in English. The We Speak English book speaks for itself. Now, the next paragraph I think is particularly important. Equally important is the value for teachers. A major challenge in literacy education is keeping the teachers' tutors engaged and excited about the learning and the teaching. It can be difficult to maintain enthusiasm while teaching basic language. As you know, everyone learns at a different pace. The pace can be challenging for tutors, particularly when the subject matter is uninteresting to adults. The challenges presented in Verbalize the Visual encourage the active and creative involvement of the teacher, thereby mitigating and minimizing teacher fatigue, boredom, and burnout. The endorsement by a teacher who has used the materials confirms their value for both student and teacher. This is a characteristic that is unique in the world of adult literacy and should not be overlooked. Thank you, Marge. I think it's important that teachers maintain interest in their subject matter. And I personally find each story written by one of my students to be very interesting. So let's go to another story and another photo. The story is a bit different from the last one. This insect is a horrible animal, the royal Goliathus beetle. Everybody knows him as a bed bug. We can find those insects in many places. The bed bugs are not friendly. They are the most harmful insect because they make a tick bite on the skin and suck up too much blood. I think bed bugs are repulsive insects. Good for this student. He picked up on a word in the vocabulary list, bed bug, and he wrote a fascinating little story. So, continuing on with the reactions of others. As we were trying to get funding to publish the books, we talked with the Director of Program Services at Literacy New York and shared the prototypes of the books with her. And she wrote, I think this curriculum could work really well as a sort of writer's workshop for adult learners in a classroom setting especially. As far as using this in a one-to-one setting, the practices could be used as part of a tutoring session, encouraging writing and speaking. The curriculum would empower tutors, small group instructors who are sometimes not confident in teaching writing as well. It is easy to follow Mr. Mudge's instructional design. I like the idea of having job-related photos, etc., for use with specific audiences too. Please take this as an endorsement. I see potential in the use of these materials with both ELLs and adult basic education learners. Writing and talking about one's writing are challenging tasks, and this curriculum supports the process in an accessible and interesting way. Another endorsement from a professor at Mount St. Mary College. This book could be used from elementary through adult. I have worked with Literacy Volunteers of America and was a tutor trainer. I've also taught in elementary through college. The book is a good appearance for use by adults in a literacy writing program. I can see this program adapted for all ages. I like the concept and the simplicity of use. This is important when time is of the essence. So there we were in 2012 with 2 books, impressive endorsements, and no funding to publish them. And I did not want to fund the publication. So they sat on my shelf. And then in the COVID doldrums, I said, hey, maybe we ought to pull those out and see what we can do with them. So I talked with Ed Advance, and they said, if you want to use them in teaching ESL with Ed Advance, let's give it a try. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. Maybe let's move to the next slide. I think it's very important that students feel that they have ownership of their learning materials. So I developed a cover for binders that I give to each student. I speak English, I write English, I read English by, and I invite my students to sign their name on the first day of every class. And that becomes the cover for their binder. Then the next visual, I use a format, an agenda for every class. I focus on vocabulary and pronunciation, grammar and sentence structure. I give them a text and we discuss it. And then we focus on stories and lessons, their stories about a photo in the book, and lessons from homework, which I develop based on the stories that they write. All very simple. Next visual. I give them a story sheet for the next photo. I give it to them in 8.5 by 11 format. I give it to them on lined paper, encourage them to write in their handwriting, and they all usually come back with a handwritten story based on, next slide, based on the vocabulary in the book and questions and hints down below. This list of vocabulary comes from 3 Horses. Then I give them lessons from homework. Next visual, please. Lessons from homework. And I think this is really important, to identify a mistake and then talk about it, and then identify correct English. Take a look at the 4th one. If the pole it cracked may occur an accident. If the pole it cracked may occur an accident. Very clear that if somebody says that, you know what he's saying or she's saying, but that's not correct English. The correct way to say it, if the pole cracks, an accident may occur. And it's very simple to teach that lesson when one identifies the mistake and then the correct English. Now, when I type up the stories, I put the initials of the author next to the story. I do not do that when I identify mistakes. The mistakes are anonymous.
Moby,
So,
Moby, excuse me, do you want to open up? There's some questions in the chat you might want to answer. Do you want to wait until the end?
we're almost there.
Okay.
Let's get through.
Okay.
So next visual, please. So to be honest, we can all play show and tell. There's nothing special about what I've developed. The books exist, the 2012 versions. They're available to educational institutions at printing cost plus shipping. I don't want to pay to print boxes of books that'll sit in my kitchen. I'm going to revise them slightly to modify my expression of appreciation to Literacy Connections, which actually failed to get the funding. I have a rather elegant expression of appreciation for funding that never materialized. And those will be available to educational institutions at cost plus shipping, order a publisher if anybody wants to publish them. So let's go to the final photo. This photograph dates from 1963, nearly 60 years ago. And here are two slightly different stories written by students from Guatemala. A hoe is an agricultural tool used to agitate the surface of the soil around plants and to remove weeds. I see a woman working the land with her tool, which is a hoe. And look, she is carrying her child on her back. Poor lady. She probably has to work long hours on the land and then go home and cook as well. Written by a young lady from Guatemala. The next is written by a young man from Guatemala. We can see the hoe is in Africa, but just the hoe is not enough for those people. They need fertile land and rain. If they have fertile land and rain, they can have a good harvest. Maybe that's the sentence to end on. If they have fertile land and rain, they can have a good harvest. There's no question in my mind that the visual does stimulate the verbal, and that stories written by students based on photographs can be a very effective springboard to teaching students how to speak, read, and write. So there it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Moby. So we do have a few questions in the chat. The first one was, will you show a vocabulary and hint sheet that goes with one of the stories? And actually, I think, Susan, that question was answered, correct?
Yes, I
did. And
the
then
slide.
also, if you go back to here, there we
go. There's another visual. Go to visual number 20. This is the vocabulary list for 3 horses and the questions and hints. I should say that
question they asked what? Go ahead.
I should say that the questions and hints are are there to be provocative. Students do not generally try and answer all of them, which is fine. They can also be used for discussion in class. And the way I use them is to ask the students to ask each other the questions, and then to answer the questions. So you get one student to ask a question, another student to answer a question, and I try and get them to answer in complete sentences, not just words. And that, in my mind, is very important, both in writing and in speaking. And that is that people communicate in sentences that can be simple, but we don't communicate just by words. We need to communicate in statements and sentences.
We have another question. It says, would like more information about the level ESL he has used this with and examples of the prompts he gives. Well, the prompts are already there. So what level of ESL have you used this with?
I think the answer to that is not basic beginners. People who have some ability in English.
And do you give them the vocabulary first?
Oh, yes. I give them the vocabulary. They have the book, and the book has the vocabulary in it. I also give them a sheet, such as Visual 20, and ask them to write out the meanings, use the sheets to write out the meanings. If they want to write in the book, that's one thing. If they want to use the sheets, that's another. It's up to them.
Do you do the lessons from the homework, as in slide 21, for each student, or is it as a class?
As a class.
Or is it already in the book?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So are these mistakes from your students when they do the writings, the waves looks calm? That's a mistake they made when they did a writing, correct?
Correct.
And are these mistakes, these lessons from the homework, are they in the book as well, or do you hand them out individual, like
no, I hand them out in class. The book exists. The mistakes come up as the students write a story.
Okay. Another question was, this is a great project. How much would the books cost at cost?
I've had different prices from 2 different printers. And the cost depends on the quantity ordered. The books that I'm using now cost us $24 each. And that's
Have you ever
that's cost without shipping, and there's no profit there.
Okay. Have you ever considered using film or video clips to stimulate writing?
Not very hard. All I've really done is this.
And then how do you introduce the pictures in order to stimulate the responses?
I say homework. Let's go back one slide, maybe. One more slide. Oh no, go to slide 18. That's the format for the class agenda. And you see under homework, study vocabulary for photograph, whatever. Write your story for photograph, whatever. And then study the text. So they have the book. Study the vocabulary for 3 horses. Write your story for 3 horses.
For the grammar lessons, do you just hand out the lessons from homework sheets, or do you go into more in-depth grammar explanations?
I try and develop obviously if something comes up in the homework, that becomes a basis for a grammar lesson. But I basically, so I focus on lessons from homework in the grammar lessons sometimes. But I also think it's very important to focus on basic grammar. So it's not limited to their mistakes.
And are the books reusable, or do students write their own stories in each book?
The books are reusable. The stories that they write are not written in the books. The stories that they write are written on a story sheet, which I hand out. Look at Visual 19. I give that to them for every photo. I give it to them on 8.5 by 11 paper, lined paper, so that they can write in straight lines.
How does classwork support or build upon the writing homework?
I'm sorry?
How does classwork support or build upon the writing homework?
Go to slide, well, go to slide 21. And there are 2 answers. One is I distribute corrected copies of their stories. I take the student stories, I correct them, and I type them up. And I give the entire class the stories that the individual members have written. And then we have a reading session. And sometimes they read their own stories. Sometimes they read each other's stories. And I let them decide how they want to do that. And I try and generate class interest in each other's stories, and that generally works. It's generally successful. They become interested in each other's stories. They become interested in each student reading either his own or another's story. And then you have the lessons from homework, where I give them a typed sheet of the mistakes and the correct English, and we go from their mistakes to correct English. Now, I think it's important not to identify a mistake with a particular student.
Another participant says, I have used a similar practice in citizenship where I use current news articles to promote discussion about civic questions. For example, in dealing with constitutional law, I showed a picture of children receiving polio vaccines and coupled it with an article about the constitutionality of mandating vaccines. Visuals definitely help to promote discussion and understanding. Video clips are also powerful. Oh, there is no question. It was just a comment. Thank you, Kathy. There is one more question. Is all the writing done outside of class?
Yes, it's homework. But the discussion in class is important. And I try and structure that so that we're talking correct English in class.
It says, how do you deal with widely different levels? For example, if some students can barely come up with a few correct sentences, will they feel frustrated or left out?
A good question. In my current class, there are students of quite different levels, and it seems to work. The more advanced students are quite willing to help the less advanced students. And it's a collaborative effort.
How do you introduce the vocab list for each story? Do you go over the whole list?
No, I basically give them a vocabulary list. The vocabulary list is in the book, and then frequently the pronunciation lessons focus on the vocabulary for a particular story.
If all writing is outside of class, wouldn't Google Translate be an issue?
Would what be an issue?
Google Translate.
I'm not familiar with that.
Having them write in their own language and then Google translate it into English and using that as their sentences.
If they want to do that, that's okay. I'm not grading them. If they, at the point in time when they've written the story out and then read it aloud in class, they have learned something. I'm not trying to test them or grade them. I'm trying to get them to communicate effectively. And if they use a Google Translate facility, that's okay. If I were trying to grade them, that'd be different, but I'm not.
Is there anybody else who would like to say something, not through text since we're done with the questions? If you can try to unmute yourself and say something. We have 8 minutes left. I'm not even sure if you guys can unmute yourselves. I wonder if somebody, how about Susan, can you try, not putting you on the spot, but can you try unmuting yourself?
Yes, I did. Okay. I really enjoyed this. It's a great idea. I use pictures, but I never thought of doing the mistake page and the vocabulary page. I think that would be really an incentive or a help for someone new to writing. So I'm going to try some of these ideas in my class. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Anybody else want to say anything before we close up the meeting? Any other questions in the chat? Okay, well, I want to thank Moby for his presentation and thank all the participants for attending. Don't forget that we have the evaluations that are going to be sent to you at the end of the meeting. And then the next thing on the agenda for today is a keynote speaker, which is Donna Beagle, not sure how to pronounce her name. And that will be from, if I'm not mistaken, 10 to 11 or 10 to 11:30. It says, also remember that
10:15 to
30 minutes
11:15.
post conferences, use the links on the sponsor page for the attachable if you want the presentations. Let me see. Visit sponsors at any point throughout the day and 30 minutes post conference using the links on the sponsor page attached to the clickable grid. And that is it. Thank you. Oh, thank you, Nicholas. 10:15 to 11:15 is a keynote speaker. Anything else you want to say, Moby, before I close the meeting?
No, I think it's a lot of fun. And you can use any photo. I mean, this is not fancy stuff. It's basically show and tell.
Okay, so I guess we're free to go. We're 5 minutes early, but that's good. Anybody wants coffee, bathroom break, water break? I have my water with me, but if you don't have it with you, you can go grab it now. And again, thank you so much for joining us. See you in another presentation. Bye-bye. Thank you, Moby. That was awesome.
Thank you, Rachel.